Hi, Minister. What's new with our forces in Port Sudan? What can you tell us, please?
We are relocating to Port Sudan from the Wadi Sedna Airport, where we were successful in having 6 evacuation flights and taking 550 Canadians and citizens of our allies as well. So we still have 2 ships off the coast of Sudan, and we're working very closely with Global Affairs Canada and with our allies to ensure the safety and security of all Canadians. Thank you.
The alleging that Ukraine tried to assassinate Putin. What do you think of these allegations? Is this Russia's attempt to use propaganda to try to get more people on their side? What do you think this is, and do you have any information on it?
I have been briefed with the information that we know about this issue, but we are still seeking additional information, and so I would not speculate on it at this point. But the fact remains that this war is illegal and unjust and caused by Putin's regime, and the way that peace will come to Ukraine is if Putin leaves. Thank you.
Français aussi, peut-être?
Oui, pour la dernière question, j'ai reçu un briefage ce matin sur cet enjeu et à ce moment, ce n'est pas prudent pour moi d'offrir les commentaires. Mais le fait est, ça c'est une guerre injustifiable et illégale et nous voulons avoir la paix. Et on peut avoir la paix et la fin de la guerre si Poutine quitte le pays Ukraine. Merci beaucoup.
Look, I just wanted to share the latest information on the immigration response to the situation in Sudan. We had an opportunity to meet with leaders from the Canadian Sudanese community just a few evenings ago earlier this week with my colleague Harjit Sajjan and Brian May, the Parliamentary Secretary as well. We are continuing to identify opportunities to take additional steps to support those who have fled the situation in Sudan or who may need to. Initially, we made a decision to extend the ability of those who were here temporarily to stay in Canada and have access to a work permit or a study permit so they can support themselves or undertake a period of study. And we've been prioritizing the processing of cases for anyone who's been impacted by the violence in Sudan, including Sudanese nationals. The latest step that we've taken is for the family members who are foreign nationals of Canadian citizens or permanent residents that were part of the evacuation efforts just over the past number of days. There's a significant number of people who are in such a situation that are currently in Nairobi. We will be extending access to open work permits or to a study permit as may be necessary for the family members of Canadian citizens and permanent residents who have been evacuated, so they too will have a pathway to come to Canada for a period of time. In the meantime, we're working on additional measures in collaboration now with leaders from the Sudanese community in Canada to identify what further steps we may need to advance in order to provide a pathway for vulnerable people to come to Canada. If I can break from the immigration response for a while, the situation is extremely dangerous. There have been people who work with our partner organizations like the International Organization for Migration who've been killed in the violence already. We are watching very closely what is taking place. We're seeing estimates that there may be 800,000 people who are fleeing the country. Before the violence broke out, Sudan played host to more than 1 million people who had already been displaced from another country, with approximately 2.7 million additional people who'd been displaced internally. It's not too far in our collective memories, the genocide in Darfur and the possibility for the situation to continue to be dangerous. I remain optimistic there will be an opportunity to have a ceasefire to reduce the violence, at least for a short period of time, so those who are seeking to flee may be able to do it safely. We're going to continue to work closely with the Sudanese community in Canada to identify opportunities to provide pathways to Canada for additional people who may be vulnerable, but in the meantime, those who've been evacuated and maybe the family members of Canadian citizens or permanent residents who've made it out as part of that evacuation effort will have access to an open work permit and a pathway to come to Canada.
So are you giving any consideration to Sudanese who do not have any linkage to Canada who are fleeing this conflict and trying to find some sort of safe haven?
We're trying to identify the next steps right now, including steps that may benefit Sudanese nationals. There's a couple pieces of feedback that I've been hearing so far that are helping inform the process of policy development. When I speak to members of the Sudanese community in Canada, their concern is for their loved ones who've been impacted and have been asking whether we can identify an opportunity to promote family reunification for people who are in fact impacted by the violence or displaced. The other chapter of concern, so to speak, is for the potential overflow of people who are forced to flee as a result of the violence. We are trying to identify opportunities to collaborate with partners on the international stage. Of course, with 1 million refugees in the country before the violence broke out, this is going to put enormous pressure on the world of settlement organizations that are focused on the region right now. UNHCR will obviously have an active role to coordinate efforts, and we need to be not only considering resettlement pathways for people who might need a safe haven to flee the violence. We're going to need to be focused on building the capacity of countries in the region who are going to be dealing with the immediate outflow of people. As I think you can appreciate, things are evolving in real time, and of course with our diplomatic staff having now fled to escape the violence themselves, the logistical challenges are very real, but we're going to be taking information from people who are plugged into those on the ground, whether that's family members in Canada or our partner organizations on the international stage. So we don't have precise clarity on what the next policy will look like to welcome Sudanese nationals, but we're working on options right now.
So just so I'm clear, I know you said the priority is going to be family members of Canadians. Are you still considering those Sudanese who don't have any Canadian connection?
We've not removed any options. We are actively exploring opportunities to reconnect families, but the appropriate policy response will be determined by what plays out on the ground, including the response of the international community. There, in fact, were already people who were in our different immigration streams or refugee streams that found themselves in Sudan who were thinking of coming to Canada. We have been prioritizing their applications. We will be trying to identify what the best role is for Canada to play in collaboration with the UNHCR and others who are going to be working more closely on the ground and in the region to deal with the outflow of people. So we haven't developed our official policy in response for Sudanese nationals with no connection to Canada, but we are starting by actively looking at familial connections, but we will have more to say in the near future about what the next policy opportunities will be to create pathways for Sudanese nationals seeking to come to Canada. Yeah, have we? Look, I can probably take one more. I just see that I don't want to miss a vote here.
Do you think for those Sudanese nationals that are, don't have that connection, do you think the best pathway is just to use the refugee system, the asylum claim system? But you've said in the past there's issues with that.
Look, the international system of refugee resettlement wasn't properly designed to respond to crises in real time. It was built around the idea that the world community had a responsibility to provide an opportunity for people who had been displaced, and practically speaking, many of them have been living in a third country with no civil, political, economic, or social rights for their entire lives, sometimes multiple generations. The international system of refugee resettlement has been built to respond to that need that built up over many generations. Canada's has become more nimble initially with the Syrian response since 2015. There were some innovations that allowed us to respond more nimbly after the evacuation of Kabul in Afghanistan. We've discovered new models of temporary protection through our response to Ukraine and the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, and the ability to give protection to people who are already here through opportunities like the response so far to Sudan and previously Iran. The reality is the facts on the ground have demonstrated to us that modern migration crises require more rapid responses than our legacy policies, not just Canada, but the developed world of nations, the developed community of nations around the world. And my view is that we need to continue to innovate in the policy space to be able to react in real time. For people who may be thinking about opportunities, obviously pay close attention to what the UNHCR may be doing on the ground, who will be playing a coordinating role for the global community to figure out what we may need to do. But in addition to any resettlement pathways, it's obvious that we need to come together to support countries in the region who are going to be dealing with the immediate inflow of migrants who escape the violence. It's obvious to me that we need to continue to put forward humanitarian assistance for those who may not be resettled but whose lives are maybe not in immediate danger. I note the $71 million investment my colleague Harjit Sajjan put forward this morning that's going to help deliver the essentials, food, water, basic health services. There are no easy answers here, but whether it's from a logistical evacuation point of view, a global affairs and peace promotion point of view, immigration or humanitarian point of view, we're looking for every opportunity we can to help people in their time of need. The situation is dire, and we're going to do whatever we can to assist. Thank you. I really should go in for the vote. Well, it looks like I'm voting on my phone, otherwise they won't let me vote. So, okay, thanks everyone.
You know, we have the Prime Minister now saying that he wasn't briefed on the Michael Chong situation until after the news came out on Monday. If this is the case, should the head of CSIS be fired?
There's so many questions around this very disturbing situation, and also around questions of foreign interference. What we really need to do, I think, is stop dealing with one brush fire and another brush fire. We need this full inquiry. We need an independent inquiry to look at this situation and try and get some answers for Canadians.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Anyone interested in talking about housing?
You have something to say?
I sure do.
All right.
We had an opposition day motion yesterday on housing and some ideas that the Conservative Party and our leader Pierre has proposed to get things moving. One of the challenges we see in this country is the added cost that municipalities can add to the cost of a house based on all the delays and the extra fees and all that kind of thing. And so we talked a lot about what we might do to encourage municipalities to get their act together and make housing cheaper and make it more available to young people that are trying to get into the market. Of course, the Liberals stood up all day yesterday, and all they talked about was how great things are. And they talked about jurisdiction. They clearly don't understand that we're in a crisis in this country right now in housing, and they just think that everything's just going fine. And of course, after 8 years, they've spent record amounts of money, and the situation's even worse. Rents have doubled, home prices have doubled, all under this Prime Minister's watch. We need real action. That's what we proposed yesterday, and we hope that we'll get some support from other members of the House, and we'll get that passed.
So can you detail your proposal there?
Yeah, we talk about actually tying federal infrastructure funding to municipalities to results on the ground, getting things done. So needless displays, we see examples of them all over the country where municipalities delay the approval of multi-unit development based on NIMBY activists in the area that just don't like change. We've talked about tying federal infrastructure funding for transit, very specifically, to making sure that the land around that transit hub, for example, is preemptively zoned and ready to go immediately for high-density residential. We've also talked about making available more vacant and underutilized federal properties, a minimum of 15%. There's no shortage of examples of buildings and properties all across this country the federal government isn't using that could be made available right now. So these are just a few of the examples that we've come up with and we've proposed and we think will work, and we think the government should adopt them.
So are you proposing that cities expropriate land around transit hubs then? Because there are still a lot of homes around these hubs, and they might be.
I'm not talking about expropriating land. I'm talking about making sure the zoning is in place so that high-density residential can be approved immediately. This is the crux of this issue. What happens in cities oftentimes is an application for a development comes in. It requires rezoning, a higher density than is currently approved or exists on the land, and it gets delayed and delayed and delayed. There are countless examples in cities all across this country. We just spoke about a couple of them here in Ottawa where there are examples where you have municipalities in areas where there's already land zoned, there's already buildings built, and someone buys a piece of land trying to do the exact same thing that exists next door, and it can take up to 3 years to get it rezoned. That's wrong. It adds cost, and it makes every unit more expensive for the people trying to buy it.
Scott, do you distinguish in your policy? I mean, there's always a distinction between affordable housing and housing that is affordable. There's a difference there, and I wonder where the party's head is at on the question of affordable housing, which is people who, are now spending 2/3 of their income on rent, or it's a different housing market than the folks you guys talk about a lot, which is like 30-somethings trying to build their own home, buy their own home.
The crux of this issue is that there is a shortage of supply overall. There are very specific types of housing for very specific needs, but more supply means lower prices. We believe that we need to get more shovels in the ground faster and eliminate the delays that are making the units getting built slower and making it more expensive.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, Minister. Two quick ones for you. First of all, Premier Newfoundland and Labrador wants to tear down the fence around St. John's Harbour. What do you think? It came up after 9/11. Is it time to tear it down or open it up a bit for tourism? What do you think?
I mean, I'm familiar with the phrase. I never thought it'd be directed at me one day. Look, on a serious note, of course, I know this is an issue of concern to the community. As I had written to the Premier, this is an issue under the purview of the port. Having said that, I'm going to follow up with the port and see if there's anything that can be done.
Second question, the Eglinton crosstown, the LRT, that the federal government surely has put hundreds of millions of dollars into. There is construction issues with the quality of the build. Are you, as the federal government, unhappy with the situation with the Eglinton crosstown? The Premier Ford and Minister Mulroney have talked about it. I have to ask you, what do you think?
Yeah, look, this is a project that is managed by the province under their Metrolinx agency, so questions should be directed to them.
Okay. You're just the guy who gives money and that's about it, right?
Canadians hold all of us accountable for the projects that we fund. We're a supporter, a partner in infrastructure projects, but ultimately the province is the one who manages that project.
Thank you for stopping. The Port of St. John's, you've read about the Premier wants to tear down the wall. Tear down the wall. What do you think? Should the Transport Minister, the federal government, get rid of that wall? Or?
That kind of came out of nowhere. It's not the most pleasant looking thing. I got to say, and I think the Premier said, it comes from a personal place. But because it's federal, I am not privy to the same freedoms, so I can't quite say how I feel about it. But needless to say, I know it aggravates a lot of people, including my constituents.
So are you gently persuading the transfer?
My personal opinion should ever enter any decision that I make. God forbid.
We're all humans.
God forbid.
The fence around St. John's Harbour. The Newfoundland Premier, or the Newfoundland and Labradorian Premier, would like to take down the security fence that they put in after 9/11. As Fisheries and Oceans Minister, what do you think? Should St. John's Harbour finally get a little more open? Better for tourism, better for people walking? What do you think?
Well, I'm happy to look into that and see if there are any Department of Fisheries aspects to that, and if so, what they are and what can be done. So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for stopping.